Good evening, everybody. How's everybody feeling tonight? Good, good. So we're going to continue with our study of literary devices. Hopefully by now, we're starting to maybe get a grasp of what it is that we're exploring. It's the idea, of course, I'm going to keep reiterating, that we can study the Bible and read it and try and understand it in a simple, literal, plain text kind of way. But I firmly believe that there are things that we're studying called literary devices that were given by God that we use even in non-biblical settings, in other types of literature and things like that. But He used those same God-given devices and inspired those who wrote the Bible, and they included them in here for a purpose. And that purpose, I believe, is to reveal not secret truths or deeper truths in the Gnostic sense, but a deeper, more full understanding, a thorough understanding of a difficult concept. Sometimes concepts are hard to put into words, and so we can employ some of these things to help us understand that as people, all right? For those that grabbed the question sheet, I am planning, if time permitting, to have a little bit of a discussion at the Exodus part. I mentioned something about looking at Exodus 12, and so I'd like to go over that towards the end of this. Just be aware of that. But for this part, I'm just going to kind of speed through it and give you guys some examples. So any questions about anything so far? Carrie?
I have a comment on your class.
Okay.
It has absolutely nothing to do with your class.
Okay.
I was just wondering, I forgot to announce that James Turner is working tonight.
Okay. James Turner was working tonight. I don't have that slide up here, but he is. Okay. So this was not a simple lesson for me to craft because we've covered a few devices that you can kind of leave standing alone. But this one we're going to talk about symbolism. It's a big, meaty device that frankly I could spend probably an entire quarter talking about, especially when we talk about the Bible. The difficulty is, though, trying to parse out symbolism from the other devices that are used within the Bible. They intertwine and they mesh and they kind of blend with each other. You'll see things like foreshadowing, imagery, metaphor, and they all kind of come together and you're like, well, which one is which? And, well, doesn't this mean, isn't lend itself more to foreshadowing than this? And I understand that. We're going to do our best to try and focus strictly on symbolism. However, that does not mean that it doesn't lend itself to other devices. So we'll try and stay on focus, but I'll do my best to not drift. So a quick and easy definition of symbolism is when a writer uses one thing to express something or represent something, I should say, that's more abstract. And they're used across all different types of literature, from novels to short stories to poems and plays. And one of the most important points in evaluating what a symbol is and what its function is and the meaning is to examine the quality of the connection. The quality of the connection. And part of the way that we do that is we examine the context that that symbol is used, and we examine the context of the suspected meaning. And what I mean by that is you want to look at who is using the symbol, if a who is involved, what the symbol is, or even like what surrounds the symbol, when it's used, where it's used, how, the basic questions, right? The 5 whys and a how. The who, what, when, where, why, and how. Those are important because, again, the trap that we can fall into is if I look at something and I put my own subjective interpretation on what that symbol might mean. We can't do that. So how do we avoid that? We have to study what we suspect this might be and look at the context and decide, is there a very strong connection with how we see the symbol and the meaning that we see later within the text? If they don't match, you have to let it go. I've had to do that many times. Like, well, this kind of looks like this, and then when I read, I'm like, it's just not there. It's just not there. So that's important. We have to examine the context and do our absolute best to find a strong quality in the connection, okay? Don't want to beat a dead horse on that. Here's a couple of obvious examples, right? So going back to Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. The letter A is worn by Hester Prynne, and it's frequently presented in the novel, but not in the same way that trees or houses or people are in the novel. There's a peculiarity and a uniqueness to how that letter is portrayed, and it should grab your attention. And it's often presented to the reader in many different scenes of the novel and is a constant callback to the crime of adultery that Hester committed to earn that letter. It's also the literal name of the book, so it's got to mean something, right? Okay, this is what I mean by it's obvious. It kind of interprets itself. Pretty plain. Here's an example from the Bible. So in Daniel's vision in chapter 8, he says in the verse, "I looked up and saw a ram with 2 horns standing at the canal. Its 2 horns were both long, but one was longer than the other." And Daniel then describes seeing a goat and says, "I saw it approaching the ram. It went into a fit of rage against the ram and struck it and broke off its 2 horns." So is Daniel wanting to simply entertain his readers with this weird story about animals fighting each other? No, there's clearly more than meets the eye. Right? He's not just telling us this to be entertaining. And so where we find that is in verse 20. He narrates exactly what the angel Gabriel said to him, which read, "The ram that you saw with the 2 horns stands for the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king." Okay? Pretty obvious example. Okay, I think this means something, Daniel, but I'm not really sure what it is. Well, we read a little bit further, and Daniel answers the question for us, right? It's a symbol, but it's an obvious symbol. It's interpreted almost immediately after it's given. But symbols a lot of the times are much more subtle in how they're placed within literature. And in my opinion, they have a stronger effect on the reader when they're done that way. They provide this aha moment that brings clarity to an idea, and they can express an abstract concept more precisely. Or they reveal a deeper, more substantial truth beyond the mere words on the page. A couple of tangible examples, and by tangible I mean it's like an actual object or a person. It's something that you can physically observe and touch, right? So in Orwell's 1984, the ever-present objects known as telescreens function not as merely a surveillance tool of the population, but come to represent the all-seeing eye, the oppressive stare, and the inescapable paranoia of the totalitarian regime known as Big Brother. If anybody needs me to repeat that, I can't, but I think you get the point. Orwell is expressing this feature about totalitarian dictatorships in a richer, much more evocative manner than simply saying a highly restrictive government would watch everyone all the time. It's in every scene, behind every page. It comes to be this tangible symbol to show what he's trying to prove. So another tangible symbol in the Bible is the dove. The symbol of the dove appears in many different contexts and passages, but most, if not all, tend to symbolize peace. We read in Leviticus 1:14 through 17, it describes the offering of doves as follows. "If his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, he must present his offering from the turtle doves or from the young pigeons. Finally, the priest must offer it up in smoke on the altar on the wood which is in the fire. It is a burnt offering, a gift of a soothing aroma to the Lord." There's peace, right? But that's just one example. I can't say, oh, it's obviously representing peace, right? We need probably more to establish this quality of connection. So let's look at the second one. In Psalm 55, 5 and 6. "Fear and panic overpower me. Terror overwhelms me. I say, I wish I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and settle in a safe place." So you got to ask yourself, why did he say dove? Is it just because that was the only bird he could think of? Well, clearly there were many other birds that people in Bible times knew about. You have eagles and pigeons and owls and many other things. My suggestion to you is that he chose that because it is a symbol of peace, right? The wings could have been for many other birds, but a dove was chosen to bring the author to safety. We look at the flood. At the end of this cataclysmic flood, in return to safety on land was signaled by the releasing of a dove, which settled on the earth. A raven was used first, but then a dove was used. And that signaled when the flood was over and when man could return to earth again and it was safe. Peace had been made between God and man in that moment, is at least how I see it. And then there's also the famous scene recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four of them, that upon Jesus coming up from the waters of baptism, the Spirit descended upon him in the form of a dove, while the Father declared Jesus to be his Son. Jesus had peace with the Father, unlike any other person. And I think it's important to note that it's in all four Gospels. You don't see that too often with all four Gospels, that they all have the same pericope. So symbols can occur in more ways than just a tangible object. Characters themselves can serve as symbols. And a sort of non-biblical example would be Aslan from the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Aslan is an empathetic, kind, and has a strong moral compass. And he ultimately sacrifices himself to the White Witch in Edmund's place and is later resurrected to help Lucy, Susan, Edmund, and Peter restore harmony in the land. Aslan obviously performs tasks within this narrative that are literal, but his character represents something bigger than what he simply does. And then there is, of course, the obvious parallel to Jesus' sacrifice and resurrection. In a similar fashion, Aslan comes to symbolize strength, hope, and goodness within the narrative. He's not simply a lion that wanders around and does certain things. He symbolizes something. And a biblical example of symbolic character is Adam. Adam functions as a literal person within the narrative of Genesis and other portions of the Bible. However, he also serves as a figurative, symbolic function. Adam's literal actions brought sin into the world. His presence elsewhere in the Bible is used symbolically of the sin mankind has brought into their own lives. Hosea 6:4 reads, "What am I going to do with you, O Ephraim? What am I going to do with you, O Judah?" And then in verse 7, like Adam, they broke the covenant. Oh, how they were unfaithful to me. Paul writes in Romans 5:12, "So then, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all people because all sinned. For before the law was given, sin was in the world, but there is no accounting for sin when there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who did not sin in the same way that Adam, who is a type of the coming one, transgressed." So his function there, he had a literal purpose. He literally lived on earth. He literally did certain things. But his character, his person, if we want to call it that, came to symbolize something more than just that. Events can also be symbolic. This example might be a little bit strange in defining it as an event, so just please bear with me. In Mark Twain's The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn, the act of Huck and his friend Jim floating on the river is symbolic of the freedom they both seek. And for those unfamiliar with the setting, the story takes place in Missouri in the 1830s when Missouri was still a slave state. Jim, being a black man, was a runaway slave who befriended Huck and sought to escape to the free states via the river. Huck also sought freedom from his abusive father, and the civilizing, as he called it, others tried to force on him, and accompanied Jim on the river voyage. The literal voyage on the river liberated both Jim and Huck, but it also came to symbolize freedom itself as they traveled along and met other characters and became entangled in different scenarios. The river voyage pushed them ever closer to freedom. In the same way, Jesus' death on the cross was literal and symbolic. He literally died on the cross, but the symbolism of the cross was so palpable that Paul identified it with a curse. In Galatians 3:13, he wrote, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree.'" Paul identifies the death on the cross as a symbol representing the curse of sin, which Christ removed for us by his sacrifice on the cross. So on to Exodus 12. All right. Did anybody follow up on this assignment? Anybody find symbols within chapter 12? What I think is cool about this, and we're going to do kind of like a reverse after this one. So chapter 12, of course, is a big chapter, but you can find multiple symbols, and they kind of jut off into different areas of the narrative or other areas of the Bible itself. After we discuss this, I have one where I pick one symbol and I can show you how it kind of permeates the rest of the Bible in its own way. So does anybody have anything that they notice that's symbolic about chapter 12? Yeah, Carol. Say that one more time. The blood over the door. Can you explain what you mean, how that's symbolic?
It was symbolic of sort of what we have through the blood of Christ, is their salvation from death.
Okay, so the blood being used on the doorpost was symbolic, perhaps even foreshadowing, of Jesus' blood and what it does for us. It covers us. It allows us to pass from death to life. Allows us to be passed over in that sense. What else? Yep. I apologize. I cannot hear you. The unblemished lamb. What's symbolic about the unblemished lamb? Okay. So the unblemished lamb represents something more than just a lamb that was sacrificed. It represents the perfection of a sacrifice that's needed by God in order to be found righteous. And Jesus is that for us, of course. What else? Maybe if I read, it'll jog some memories here. I'm going to start in the beginning. Not that beginning, but, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month is to be your beginning of months. It will be your first month of the year. Tell the whole community of Israel, in the 10th day of this month, they must each take a lamb for themselves according to their families, a lamb for each household. If any household is too small for a lamb, the man and his next door neighbor are to take a lamb according to the number of people. You will make your count for the lamb according to how much each one can eat. Your lamb must be perfect, a male, 1 year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You must care for it until the 14th day of this month, and then the whole community of Israel will kill it around sundown. They will take some of the blood and put it on the 2 side posts and top of the doorframe of the houses where they will eat it. They will eat it the same night. They will eat it roasted over the fire with bread made without yeast and with bitter herbs. Do not eat it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire with its head, its legs, and its entrails. You must leave nothing until morning, but you must burn with fire whatever remains of it until morning. This is how you are to eat it, dressed to travel. Your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. I will pass through the land of Egypt in the same night, and I will attack all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both of humans and of animals, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, so that when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and this plague will not fall on you to destroy you when I attack the land of Egypt." So we covered a couple of them right there, right? Anybody notice any different ones? Okay. Sure, I can see that. It's kind of like, the way I saw it was, it's a declaration of a new beginning. Because what does he say this day will be? It will be the first day of the first month. This is the beginning, right? What's the beginning of what? It's the beginning of their freedom. It's the beginning of their sovereignty as a nation. This is the formation of Israel. We're watching it happen right now. And it begins that day. And it begins with this act, right? He's liberating them by that. What else? What's symbolic about that?
Leaven or yeast would represent sin to them in general, and unleavened bread is
So it does mention that, right? In verse 20, just to be clear, you will not eat anything made with yeast. In all the places where you live, you must eat bread without yeast. This is where you need to be careful, though, because while Jesus does make it very clear that he uses yeast as a symbol of sin and a lot of other attributes, I guess, can be given to it, there are times that sacrifices brought to the Lord can be made with yeast. There's only two. So it's very, very few, but there are two where leaven is permissible. And it's not like, well, only if you have yeast bread, then it's okay. It's like, no, specifically, if you want to bring me an offering, you can use yeast. However, I would generally agree with you on that because we can have this kind of foreshadowing of what's to come with that. Let me see. I covered a couple here. The blood on the doorpost. Okay. Verse 11. This is how you are to eat it, dressed to travel, your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. The people must be literally dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. The haste they eat with and preparedness they demonstrate symbolizes the anticipation of salvation and readiness to flee from sin and oppression. Okay? We didn't read it because it's much further in chapter 4, but it talks about how they are to do no work for 7 days. And to me, that was symbolic of the reliance upon God that they have to have. God tells them that they will keep the day as a reminder of how he delivered them from Egypt. And the nation of Israel could not work for their own freedom. In the same way, God had to deliver them. Circumcision was also a prerequisite for participation in the Passover. And that prerequisite applied to both foreigners and native-born people. Therefore, circumcision was required to be saved from the wrath of God in Egypt. The circumcision symbolizes a holiness or setting apart desired by the Lord in order to be saved. In Ezekiel 44:9, this is what the sovereign Lord says, no foreigner who is uncircumcised in heart and flesh among all the foreigners who are among the people of Israel will enter into my sanctuary. In Colossians 2:11, in him you were also circumcised, not, however, with a circumcision performed by human hands, but by the removal of the fleshly body, that is through the circumcision done by Christ. So again, this Passover, which is providing salvation through God's power, of course, you had to be circumcised. This was symbolic, in my opinion, of the holiness that's required of God. You had to be not just physically circumcised, as we read later on in Ezekiel. Right, we move from this physical to the spiritual. It even says, no foreigner who is uncircumcised in heart and flesh among all the foreigners will enter into my sanctuary. And then, of course, in Colossians, it's not a bodily circumcision he's concerned about. It's a spiritual through Christ. So anything else that anybody cares to mention? Okay. So like I said, this is Exodus chapter 12. We could probably tear this apart and find even more symbols, right? But this is one passage, and we can pull out multiple symbols within this, and they connect to other passages throughout the Bible, as we've talked about. So I'd like to talk about this one. Water. Water is most definitely a symbol used throughout the Bible, but its meaning can morph as God attempts to illustrate a concept to us. So let's look at this one sequence to see how water serves its purpose as a symbol. So in Genesis 6:17, of course we know this is Noah and the flood. He says, I am about to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy from under the sky all living creatures that have the breath of life in them. Everything that is on the earth will die. So clearly, water here is literally used as a means of destruction and judgment against mankind. Symbolically, though, it might mean something. This is only one passage, but I'll tell you this right now. I believe it represents death. But this is just one, right? One passage. We move on to Exodus 14 and 27. So Moses extended his hand toward the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state when the sun began to rise. Now the Egyptians were fleeing before it, but the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the middle of the sea. The water returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the army of Pharaoh that was coming after the Israelites into the sea. Not so much as one of them survived. But the Israelites walked on dry ground in the middle of the sea, the water forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Water, again, literally destroys something. It destroys all of the Egyptians that were coming after Israel. And in this case, water also symbolically represents death. Right? And we can start to see how another meaning is starting to emerge with it, and that's one of God's salvation. God used water to both condemn and save, like when he saved Noah and his family and condemned the rest of mankind. This is one of my favorite passages because there's just so much packed into this. Matthew 14 and 25. The very famous Jesus walking on the water. As the night was ending, Jesus came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost," and cried out with fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, "Have courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, order me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, he became afraid and started to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" There's several symbols within this passage, but I want to focus just on the water. The water still symbolizes death, right? Peter is, along with the other crewmates, probably deathly afraid. The water's being sloshed over the boat, they're being tossed about. I don't know that they knew how to swim. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But nonetheless, if anybody has ever been in rough tide, it's not a place you want to be swimming. There's a strong chance that you're not going to make it. This definitely represented death for them if they were to go into it. In them seeing Jesus, Peter decides that he's going to have faith and go out to him. And so he starts to walk to him by Jesus' power. And of course, he gets worried by what's around him and starts to sink into the water. That's when it sets in. I'm going to die. And he says, "Lord, save me." And he reaches down, and immediately it says, brings him up and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This water symbolized death, but salvation was still present once more when Jesus saved Peter from being taken into the water. I would like to think that I understand what Peter was thinking, but maybe I'm just putting my own spin on it. I think that this is what inspired him to come up with this passage. Remembering how it was for him on that boat and walking out to Jesus. He had to have known how scary that was. He had to have remembered and recalled how scary that was. And so he delivers this to us in this letter. 1 Peter 3:20, God patiently waited in the days of Noah as an ark was being constructed. In the ark, a few, that is 8 souls, were delivered through water. And this prefigured baptism, which now saves you. Not the washing off of physical dirt, but the pledge of a good conscience to God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then in Colossians 2:12, Paul writes, "Having been buried with him in baptism, you also have been raised with him through your faith in the power of God, who raised him from the dead." I believe Peter recognized the symbolic nature of water, and he recalled the event with Noah and the flood. The flood waters symbolized death in the same way the baptismal waters symbolize death. At the same time, God is working through the water to bring salvation and life. He saved Noah from the evil generation he lived with. He saved Israel from sin and oppression of Egypt. He saved Peter from the waves on the Sea of Galilee. Through our faith in Christ's death and our water baptism into his death, we rise to life in the same way Christ did by God's power. So, that's pretty much all I have for tonight. Unless somebody has questions or comments about anything that they've read? Micah.
Actually, I had a thought come in mind when you were talking about 1 Peter 3:20, because, or going back to the Matthew verse, it really stirred up my mind about how making that comparison between baptism and, you know, I don't think Peter saw it at that time, maybe later on, but who was a person who pulled him up out of the water? Is Christ. So, I mean, you could maybe draw a comparison there between that. I mean, I know this is about water, but
Mm-hmm.
as far as the salvation, that like, yeah, Peter listened to the voice of Christ to walk on the water, but what happened when everything fell apart around him?
Mm-hmm.
Who was the one who helped pull him out? It was Christ.
Yeah.
And I think there's a point to be made, like even in our faith, when we're listening, we're obeying, and when the storm comes, maybe we sink sometimes, but if we cry out in prayer, go to His Word, who's going to pull us up out? I believe it's going to be Christ.
Yep, 100%. I couldn't agree more. I think that Peter represents us absolutely in that sense, and that's what I think is so fascinating, and if I can say it, cool about that passage specifically. And yeah, I think there probably was more when Peter wrote that specific passage about Noah and the flood, but trying to keep it kind of focused to a symbol. But yeah, I agree with you. I think there was more to that. Yes, Cindy. Oh, that's right. You proved me wrong. Why you got to do that to me right now? Okay, so we did learn something tonight. Peter could swim, everyone. Peter could swim. Yeah. Peter could swim. Any other thoughts or comments? I see a few. I'll come to you, Carrie.
Sometimes, unfortunately, the world looks at symbolism as a way of not doing things, because they'll say, well, it's an outward sign of an inward grace, and it's just symbolism. And so I think there's a danger with not really having a good definition of what that symbolism actually is required. There are requirements in symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
To say that it's an outward sign of an inward grace, that baptism is not necessary. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah.
The whole concept of the symbolism.
Yeah, definitely. So I would agree. I would echo those sentiments that symbolism can be hijacked by people who see it as a way to not have to believe or not have to follow what is being demonstrated by the symbol and just brush it off as, well, that's just figurative. I don't actually have to do that. And I guess my whole point is, no, this is literal, right? If it's literal and there is a symbol behind it, that doesn't mean you don't have to do it. In the same way that a stop sign represents, well, you must stop. It doesn't state the penal code for, how you stop a vehicle. It just says stop. That's what it's representative of. It means this is what you must do when you're confronted with this. So yeah, I appreciate that thought, Larry. Carrie, and I saw a couple other hands.
I'm like everybody else. You get into items, objects, and it's so easy to ascribe meaning to it. And that's just one of the interesting things of studying the Bible. There's also a note of caution that has to go with that, because when you start talking about symbols, you can find yourself in the realm of speculation real quick. And so when we look at symbols in the Bible, or what we might interpret as being symbols, we have to ask ourselves, did God intend us to take that as a symbol? The passage in Daniel, God told us what that symbol meant.
Mm-hmm.
We have all those symbols in Revelation. So if we're going to ascribe a certain meaning to it, we have to find, if we can, a meaning that God assigns to it. And then we can be sure. Beyond that, and we're seeing that in premillennialism, they just jump all over it, and they're into the area of speculation for the doorpost.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just something we have to, that's a guideline.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
preventing ourselves from jumping into
Yeah, and I would heartily agree with that. I've talked with many a Jehovah's Witness that has seen certain symbols that are, in my opinion, definitely not representative of what they think. And so, yeah, we have to examine the quality, as I think, quality of the connection, and then, of course, what did God intend by this? And that's why I tend to use Scripture to interpret Scripture, right? I've shown you a symbol in Scripture, and then I allow Scripture to tell you what it means. I don't get to tell you what that means. So that's my general hermeneutical guideline. Larry?
I couldn't hear everyone, I may be repeating.
Okay.
Going back, I doubt if this is repeating, going back to Twain for a minute, Clemens. Unless Clemens wrote in Huckleberry Finn that the river symbolized that, which he didn't, okay, it is an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me is the problem with symbolism. Everything is an opinion unless the author himself has somehow signified that it is a sentence. Anytime you go and do that, without the author, we don't know his mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible to do. With Clemens, that may be, although probably if you study the life of Samuel Clemens and his view of the river, it has various aspects that more than just freedom. But coming back to that, same thing. Unless we find, as your example in Daniel, unless it says this is a symbol and this is what it means, I think we're on pretty dangerous ground in trying to guess when we start doing the I thinks
Mm-hmm.
and the I guesses.
Yeah.
Because it calls upon someone to have at least, to me at least, a really strong base of knowledge of the Old and New Testament. Not bits and pieces, but the whole thing. And that's, to me, is about the only way you can really start building any kind of sense. And even then you have to ask yourself and keep telling yourself, hey, what if I'm wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what you talked about at the beginning. What if I'm wrong on this?
Yeah, and I would agree, going to the Twain example, like, the biggest difference with that is that's fiction, right? Come up by Samuel Clemens himself, and it is subject to interpretation, of course. And I guess for me, especially with non-biblical literature, that's what's cool about it. We can have fun with it, because that's what it's intended to do most of the time. Twain himself, I believe, he started writing that book, and it started to mean a whole lot of stuff. It started to mean more than he wanted to, because near the end, he's like, well, this is starting to mean something now, and that's not what I'm known for. Let me throw Tom Sawyer in. And that's what he did. Tom Sawyer shows up, and it's an adventure book again, because it wasn't a commentary on racism and slavery and abolitionists and stuff like that. But again, that's just my opinion, as you echoed. And so it is important, just like you said, and I would agree, you have to know the full story to start picking up symbols and running with them, because otherwise, if you look at Revelation with zero context, you're like, that's kind of weird. So a dragon's going to come, and everybody's going to go in a lake of fire for 1,000 years, and then somebody on a horse is going to come with a sword coming out of their mouth. And I guess this is the tough part I struggle with even at my job, the idea of reasonableness, right? In police work, we deal with reasonableness a lot. What is reasonable? Even judges can't define what reasonable is. They just use circular logic. Like, well, it's what's reasonable. That's what's reasonable, of course. And so it is a balance. I would definitely agree with you on that. The idea of how can we find these things and make sure that they're accurate, make sure they're correct, and that we're not overstepping what God intended. And so I guess I would just give you a cautionary, yeah, it can be tough. But that's why I go back to, we examine the context and we look for the quality of the connection, and it's not necessarily going to be a one-off example. If I were to say, I guess I can't think of a good example. See, like, oh, the ravens, they brought Elijah food one time, so God didn't actually mean they were unclean. Well, no, he called them unclean for a reason. Now, maybe there's another reason why a raven brought it as opposed to a dove or an owl or an eagle or anything else. But we may never know. That would be pure speculation in my mind when you only have a one or like a really small sample size. When we can gather a large enough sample size to examine, aka the entire Bible, and compare these things, we can maybe come up with a good understanding of what these could be or might be. And as I said before, probably at the beginning of the first class, thank goodness I don't have to know all of this stuff to be saved. The gospel of Christ, I think, is not symbolic. It's spelled out for us in very plain English. And so I guess I could leave it at that for the necessariness of symbols or symbolism. But Vance. Yeah, and he definitely used parables many, many times, and those parables were symbolic in the sense that he would use symbols to represent a real meaning or perhaps even a real doctrine, if I could say that. There were plenty of times where he did explain his own parables and interpret them themselves, but there's some that he did not interpret directly or at least immediately afterwards. And I think we could go into Scripture and find that intended meaning, but Jeff. Yeah, for anyone who didn't catch that, Jeff was talking about how he had a particular thought or thought he recognized a symbol and then kind of chased that down and realized, oh wait, maybe this isn't accurate, and had to study more to come to a better understanding of what it was he was trying to see. Thought I saw a few other hands. No? Okay. Well, we're a little bit past time then, so I appreciate all the comments and the study, and look forward to 2 weeks from now, right? Yeah, okay. 2 weeks from now. Thank you, guys.